皆さん、こんばんは。いらっしゃい。今日も本読みます。今日もじゃなくて、もう時間ぶりでます。本読みますね。じゃあ入りましょうか。安定してる、コーヒー飲める。どこからだったっけ。そう。とあるスティーブンという羊のことですね。この羊は元同じ職場で働いてた、友達というか、そう、同僚ね。同僚が、その職場を出てたことを話していた羊がね、その羊は、その同僚、また同じ職場へ働いてて言いに行ってるらしい。その同僚が戻りたいなわけではない。戻りたいというわけがあると手紙で書いてあったと先言ってたけど、今言ってる途中で気づいた。それは自分で思い込んでたかもしれないということ。今からその羊の、その前に、同僚といっぱい話を語っていたね。今までの本読みは。とても悲しい話だったね。本読みましょうね。But what is the sense in forever speculating what might have happened had such and such a moment turned out differently? One could presumably drive oneself to distraction in this way. In any case, while it is all very well to talk of turning points, one can surely only recognize such moments in retrospect. Naturally, when one looks back to such instances today, they may indeed take the appearance of being crucial, precious moments in one's life, but of course, at the time this was not the impression one had. Bell が鳴ってる。誰か来たかな。来客が。But of course, at the time, this was not the impression one had. Rather, it was as though one had available a never-ending number of days, months, years, in which to sort out the vagaries of one's relationship to Miss Kenton, an infinite number of further opportunities in which to remedy the effect of this or that misunderstanding. There was surely nothing to indicate at the time that such evidently small incidents would render whole dreams forever irredeemable. そういうこともあるよね。But I see I am becoming unduly introspective and in a rather gross sort of way at that. No doubt this has to do with this late hour and the trying nature of the events I have had to endure this evening. No doubt too my present mood is not unconnected with the fact that tomorrow provided I am supplied with petrol by the local garage. As the tailors assure me I will be, I should arrive in Little Compton by lunchtime, and will, presumably, be Miss Kenton again after all. After all these years. There is of course no reason at all to suppose our meeting will be anything but cordial. In fact, I would expect our interview, aside from a few informal exchanges, quite proper in the circumstances, to be largely professional in character. That is to say, it will be my responsibility to determine whether or not Miss Kenton has any interest, now that her marriage sadly appears to have broken down and she is without a home, in returning to her old post at Darlington Hall. こういうことまで言ってなかったっけ? 離婚できたとは今知ったばかり。I may as well say here that having reread her letter again tonight, I am inclined to believe I may well have read more into certain of her lines than perhaps was wise. 思い込んでたね。But I would still maintain there is more than a hint of nostalgic longing in certain parts of her letter, particularly when she writes such things as, I was so fond of that view from the second floor bedroom, overlooking the lawn with the down visible in the distance. But then again, what is the purpose in endlessly speculating as to Miss Kenton's present wishes when I will be able to ascertain them from her own person tomorrow? And in any case, I have drifted considerably from the account I was giving of this evening's events. These last few hours, let me say it, have proved unreasonably taxing. One would have thought that having to abandon the fort on some lonely hill, having to walk down to this village in near darkness by the unorthodox route one did, would be sufficient inconvenience to befall one for a single evening, and my kind hosts, Mr. and Mrs. Taylor, would never, I am certain, have knowingly put me through what I have just endured. But the fact is, once I had sat down to supper at the table, once a member of their neighbors had come calling, the most discomforting set of events had to unfold around me. A most discomforting set of events began to unfold around me. The room downstairs at the front of this cottage would appear to serve Mr. and Mrs. Taylor as both dining room and general living quarters. It is a rather cozy room, dominated by a large, roughly hewn table of the sort one might expect to see in a farmhouse kitchen, its surface unvarnished and bearing many small marks left by choppers and bread knives. These latter I could see quite clearly despite the fact they were sitting in a low yellow light cast by an oil lamp on a shelf in one corner. It's not as though we don't have electricity out here, sir, Mr. Taylor remarked to me at one point, nodding towards the lamp. Something went wrong with the circuit, and we've been without it now for almost 2 months. To tell you the truth, we don't miss it so much. There's a few houses in the village that never had electricity at all. Oil gives a warmer light. Mrs. Taylor had served us with a good broth, which we had eaten with helpings of crispy red, crusty bread, and at that point there had been little to suggest the evening held for me anything more daunting than an hour or so of pleasant conversation before retiring to bed. However, just as we had finished supper and Mr. Taylor was pouring for me a glass of ale brewed by a neighbor, we heard footsteps approaching on the gravel outside. To my ears, there was something a little sinister, the sound of feet coming ever closer in the darkness, up to an isolated cottage, but neither my host nor hostess seemed to anticipate the menace. For it was with curiosity and nothing else in his voice that Mr. Taylor said, "Hello now, who could this be?" He had said this more or less to himself, but then we heard, as though in reply, a voice called outside, "It's George Andrews. Just happened to be walking by." The next moment, Mrs. Taylor was showing in a well-built man, perhaps in his 50s, who, judging from his dress, had spent the day engaged in agricultural work. With a familiarity which suggested he was a regular visitor, he placed himself in a small stool by the entrance and removed his Wellington boots with some effort, exchanging a few casual remarks with Mrs. Taylor as he did so. Then he came towards the table and stopped, standing to attention before me as though reporting to an officer in the army. "The name's Andrews, sir," he said. "A very good evening to you. I'm very sorry to hear about your mishap, but I hope you're not too put out to be spending the night here in Moscow." I was a little puzzled as to how Mr. Andrews had come to hear of my mishap, as he termed it. In any case, I replied with a smile that, far from being put out, I felt extremely indebted to the hospitality I was receiving. By this I had, of course, been referring to Mr. and Mrs. Taylor's kindness, and Mr. Andrews seemed to believe himself included by my expression of gratitude, for he said immediately, holding up defensively his two large hands, "Oh no, sir, you're most welcome. We're very pleased to have you. It's not often the likes of yourselves comes through here. We're all very pleased you could stop by." The way he said this seemed to suggest the whole village was aware of my mishap and subsequent arrival at this cottage. In fact, as I was soon to discover, this was very close to being the case. I can only imagine that in the several minutes after I had first been shown up to this bedroom, while I was washing my hands and doing what I could to make good the damage inflicted upon my jacket and trouser turnips, Mr. and Mrs. Taylor had conveyed news of me to passers-by. In any case, the next few minutes saw the arrival of another visitor, a man with an appearance much like that of Mr. Andrews, that is to say, somewhat broad and agricultural, wearing muddy Wellington boots, which he proceeded to remove in much the way Mr. Andrews had just done. Indeed, their similarity was such that I supposed them to be brothers, and the newcomer introduced himself to me as "Morgan, sir, Trevor Morgan." Mr. Morgan expressed regret concerning my misfortune, assuring me that all would be well in the morning before going on to say how welcome I was in the village. Of course, I had already heard similar sentiments a few moments earlier, but Mr. Morgan actually said, "It's a privilege to have a gentleman like yourself here in Moscow, sir." Before I had any time to think of a reply to this, there came the sound of more footsteps on the path outside. Soon, a middle-aged couple were shown in. Soon, a middle-aged couple were shown in, who were introduced to me as Mr. and Mrs. Harry Smith. These people did not look at all agricultural. She was a large, matronly woman who rather reminded me of Mrs. Mortimer, the cook at Darlington Hall, through much of her 20s and 30s. Contrast, Mr. Harry Smith was a small man with a rather intense expression that furrowed his brow. As they took their places around the table, he said to me, "Your car would be the vintage Ford up there on Thornley Bush Hill. If that is the hill road overlooking this village," I said, "but I'm surprised to hear you've seen it." "I've not seen it myself, sir, but Dave..." "I've not seen it myself, sir, but Dave Thornton passed it on his tractor a short while ago as he was coming home. He was so surprised to see it sitting there, he actually stopped and got out. At this point, Mr. Harrison turned to address the others around the table. Absolute beauty it is. That he'd never seen anything like it. But the car Mr. Lindsay used to drive completely in the shade. This caused laughter around the table, which Mr. Taylor next to me explained by saying, "That was a gent used to live by the big house not far from here, sir. He did one or two odd things and wasn't appreciated around here." This brought a general murmur of assent, and someone said, "Your health, sir." Lifting one of the tankards of ale Mrs. Taylor had just finished distributing, and the next moment I was being toasted by the whole company. I smiled and said, "I assure you the privilege is all mine." "You're very kind, sir," Mrs. Smith said. "That's the way a real gentleman is." But Mr. Lindsay was no gentleman. He may have had a lot of money, but he was never a gentleman. Again, there was agreement all around. Then Mrs. Taylor whispered something in Mr. Smith's ear, causing the latter to reply. He said he'd try to be along as soon as he could. They both turned towards me with a self-conscious air. Then Mrs. Smith said, "You told Dr. Carlyle you were here, sir. The doctor would be very pleased to make your acquaintance." "I expect he has patients to see," Mrs. Taylor added apologetically. "I'm afraid we can't say for certain he'll be able to call in before you'll be wanting to retire, sir." It was then that Mr. Harry Smith, the little man with the furrowed brow, leaned forward again and said, "That Mr. Lindsay, he had it all wrong, see, acting the way he did. Thought he was so much better than us, and he took us all for fools. Well, I can tell you, sir, he soon learned otherwise. A lot of hard thinking and talking goes on in this place. There's plenty of good, strong opinion around, and people here aren't shy about expressing it. That's something your Mr. Lindsay learned quickly." "He was no gentleman," Mr. Taylor said quietly. "He was no gentleman, that Mr. Lindsay." "That's right, sir," Mr. Harrison said. "You could tell just watching him he was no gentleman. All right. He had a fine house, and good suits, but somehow you just knew. And so it proved in good time." There was a murmur of agreement, and for a moment all present seemed to be considering whether or not it would be proper to divulge to me the tale concerning the local person. Then Mr. Taylor broke silence by saying, "That's true what Harry says. You can tell a true gentleman from a false one. That's just dress and finery. Take yourself, sir, it's not just the cut of your clothes, nor is it even the fine way you've got of speaking. There's something else that marks you, not as a gentleman. Hard to put your finger on it, but it's plain for all to see that's got eyes." This brought more sounds of agreement around the table. "Dr. Carlyle shouldn't be long now, sir," Mrs. Taylor put in. "You'll enjoy talking with him." "Dr. Carlyle's got it too. He's got it. He's a true gentleman, that one," Mr. Taylor said. Mr. Morgan, who had said little since his arrival, bent forward and said to me, "What do you suppose it is, sir? Maybe one that's got it had better say what it is. Here we are all talking about who's got it and who hasn't, and we're none the wiser about what we're talking about. Perhaps you could enlighten us a bit, sir." A silence fell around the table. I could sense all faces turned to me. I gave a small cough and said, "It's hardly for me to pronounce upon qualities I may or may not possess. However, as far as this particular question is concerned, one would suspect that the quality being referred to might be usefully termed dignity." Oh? I saw little point in attempting to explain the statement further. Indeed, I had merely given voice to the thoughts running around my mind while listening to the preceding talk, and it is doubtful I would have had I would have said such a thing had the situation not suddenly demanded it of me. My response, however, seemed to cause much satisfaction. There's a lot of truth in what you say there, sir, Mr. Andrews said, nodding, and a number of others' voices echoed this. That Mr. Lindsay could certainly have done with a little more dignity, Mr. Taylor said. The trouble with his sort is they mistake acting high and mighty for dignity. Mind you, put in Mr. Harry Smith, with all respect for what you say, sir, it ought to be said, dignity isn't just something gentlemen have. Dignity is something every man and woman in this country can strive for. Yet, you'll excuse me, sir, but like I said before, we don't stand on ceremony here when it comes to expressing opinions. And that's my opinion for what it's worth. Dignity is not just something for gentlemen. I perceive, of course, that Mr. Harry Smith and I were rather at cross purposes on this matter, and that it would be far too complicated a task for me to explain myself more clearly to these people. I thus judged it best simply to smile and say, of course, you're quite correct. This had the immediate effect of dispelling the slight tension that had built in the room while Mr. Harry Smith had been speaking. And Mr. Harry Smith himself seemed to lose all inhibitions, for now he leaned forward and continued. That's what we fought Hitler for, after all. If Hitler had things his way, we'd just be slaves now. The whole world would be a few masters and millions upon millions of slaves. And I don't need to remind anyone here, there's no dignity to be had in being a slave. That's what we fought for, and that's what we won. We won the right to be free citizens, and it's one of the privileges of being born English that no matter who you are, no matter if you're rich or poor, you're born free, and you're born so that you can express your opinion freely, and vote in your member of parliament, or vote him out. That's what dignity really means. That's what dignity is really about, if you'll excuse me, sir. Now, Harry, Mr. Taylor said. I can see you're warming up to one of your political speeches. This brought laughter. Mr. Harry Smith smiled a little shyly, but he went on. I'm not talking politics, I'm just saying that's all. You can't have dignity if you're a slave, but every Englishman can grasp it if only he cares to. Because we fought for that, right? This may seem like a small, out-of-the-way place we have here, sir, his wife said. But we gave more than our share in the war, more than our share. A solemnness hung in the air after she said this, until eventually Mr. Taylor said to me, Harry here does a lot of organizing for a local member. Give him half a chance and he'll tell you everything that's wrong with the way this country's run, the way the country's run. Ah, but I was just saying what was right about this country this time. What was right about the country this time? Have you had so much to do with politics yourself, sir? Mr. Andrews asked. Not directly as such, I said, and particularly not these days. More so before the war, perhaps? It's just that I seem to remember a Mr. Stevens who was a member of Parliament a year or two ago. Heard him on the wireless once or twice, had some very sensible things to say about housing, but that wouldn't be yourself, sir. Oh no, I said with a laugh. Now I'm not at all sure what made me utter my next statement. All I can say is that it seemed somehow called for in the circumstances in which I found myself. For I then said, in fact, I tended to concern myself with international affairs more than domestic ones, foreign policy, that is to say. I was a little taken aback by the effect it seemed to have upon my listeners. That is to say, a sense of awe seemed to descend on them, I added quickly. I never held any high office, and mind you, any influence I exerted was in a strictly unofficial capacity. But the hushed silence remained for several more seconds. Excuse me, sir, Mrs. Taylor said eventually, but have you ever met Mr. Churchill? Mr. Churchill? He did come to the house on a number of occasions, but to be quite frank, Mrs. Taylor, during the time I was most involved in great affairs, Mr. Churchill was not such a key figure and was not really expected to become one. The likes of Mr. Eden and Lord Halifax were more frequent visitors in those days. But you have actually met Mr. Churchill, sir. What an honor to be able to say that. I don't agree with many things Mr. Churchill says, Mr. Harry Smith said. But there's no doubt about it, he's a great man. It must be quite something, sir, to be discussing matters with his like. Well, I must reiterate, I said I didn't have a great deal to do with Mr. Churchill, but as you rightly point out, it's rather gratifying to have consorted with him. In fact, all in all, I suppose I have been very fortunate. I would be the first to admit that it has been my good fortune, after all, to have consorted not just with Mr. Churchill, but with many other great leaders and men of influence, from America and from Europe. And when you think that it was my good fortune to have had their ear on many great issues of the day, yes. When I think back, I do feel a certain gratitude. It's a great privilege, after all, to have been given a part to play, however small, on the world stage. Excuse me asking, sir, Mr. Andrews said. What sort of man is Mr. Eden? I mean, at the personal level. I've always had the impression he's a jolly decent sort. The sort that can talk to anyone high or low, rich or poor, am I right, sir? I would say that is, by and large, an accurate picture, but of course I have not seen Mr. Eden in recent years. He may have been much changed by pressures. One thing I have witnessed is that public life can change people unrecognizably in a few short years. I don't doubt that, sir, said Mr. Andrews. Even Harry here got himself involved with his politics a few years back, and he's never been the same man since. There was laughter again, while Mr. Harry Smith shrugged and allowed a smile to cross his face. Then he said, It's true, I've put a lot into the campaigning work. It's only at a local level, and I never meet anyone half as grand as the likes you associate with, sir. But in my small way, I believe I'm doing my part. The way I see it, England's a democracy, and we in this village have suffered as much as anyone fighting to keep it that way. Now it's up to us to exercise our rights, every one of us. Some fine young lads from the village gave their lives to do its privilege. And the way I see it, each one of us here now owes it to them to play our part. We've all got strong opinions here, and it's our responsibility to get them heard. Kokoku herimasu ne. じゃあ、待とうか。 戻りますね。ちょっともっと、もうちょっとゆっくり読むね。We're out of the way, alright. A small village. We're none of us getting younger. The village is getting smaller. But the way I see it, we owe it to the lads we lost from this village. That's why, sir, I give so much of my time now to making sure our voice gets heard in high places. And if it changes me, or sends me to an early grave, I don't mind. I did warn you, sir, Mr. Taylor said with a smile. There's no way Harry was going to let an influential gentleman, like yourself, come through the village without giving you his usual earful. There was laughter again, but I said almost immediately, I think I understand your position very well, Mr. Smith. I can well understand that you wish the world to be a better place, and that you and your fellow residents here should have an opportunity to contribute to the making of a better world. It is a sentiment to be applauded. I dare say it was a very similar urge which led me to become involved in great affairs before the war. Then, as now, world peace seemed something we had only the most fragile grasp of, and I wish to do any part. Excuse me, sir, said Mr. Harry Smith, but my point was a slightly different one. For the likes of yourself, it's always been easy to exert your influence. You can count the most powerful in the land as your friends, but the likes of us here, sir, we can go year in year out and never even lay eyes on a real gentleman. Other than maybe Dr. Carlyle, he's a first-class doctor, but with all respect, he doesn't have connections as such. It gets easy for us here to forget our responsibility as citizens. That's why I work so hard at the campaigning, whether people agree or disagree. And I know there's not one soul in this room now who'd agree with everything I say. At least I'll get them thinking. At least I'll remind them of their duty. This is a democratic country we're living in. We fought for it. We've all got to play our part. I wonder what could have helped to Dr. Carlyle. What could have happened to Dr. Carlyle? Mrs. Smith said. He's a first-class doctor, but I'm sure the gentleman could have just use some educated talk now. This provoked more laughter. In fact, I said, although it has been extremely enjoyable to meet you all, I must confess I'm beginning to feel rather exhausted. Of course, sir, Mrs. Taylor said. You must be very tired. Perhaps I'll fetch another blanket for you? It's getting much chiller at night now. No, I assure you, Mrs. Taylor, I'll be most comfortable. But before I could rise from the table, Mr. Morgan said, Before I could rise from the table, Mr. Morgan said, I just wonder, sir, there's a fellow we like to listen to on the wireless. His name's Leslie Mandrake. I just wondered if you'd happen to have met him. I just wondered if you'd happen to have met him. ちょっと 風邪ひいてるかな。外の空気は吸えなくなってるね。まさに毒になってる。I replied that I had not, and was about to make another attempt to retire, only to find myself detained by further inquiry regarding various persons I may have met. I was then still seated at the table when Mrs. Smith remarked, "Ah, there's someone coming. I expect that's the doctor at last." "I really ought to be retiring," I said. "I feel quite exhausted." "But I'm sure this is the doctor now, sir," said Mrs. Smith. "You wait a few more minutes." Just as she said this, there came a knock and a voice. Just as she said it, there came a knock and a voice said, "It's just me, Mrs. Taylor." The gentleman who was shown in was still fairly young, perhaps around 40 or so, tall and thin, tall enough in fact that he was obliged to stoop to enter the doorway of the cottage. No sooner had he bade us all a good evening than Mrs. Taylor said to him, "This is our gentleman here, doctor. His car's stuck up there on Thornley Bush, and he's having to endure Harry's speeches as a result." The doctor came up to the table and held out his hand to me. "Richard Carlyle," he said with a cheerful smile as I rose to shake it. "Rotten bit of luck about your car. Still, trust you're being well looked after here? Looked after rather too well, I imagine." "Thank you," I replied. "Everyone has been most kind." "Well, nice to have you with us." Dr. Carlyle seated himself almost directly across the table from me. "Which part of the country are you from?" "Oxfordshire," I said, and indeed it was no easy task to suppress the instinct to add, "Sir." "Fine part of the country." "I have an uncle who lives just outside Oxford." "Fine part of the country." "The gentleman was just telling us, doctor. He knows Mr. Church." "Is that so?" I could say, "Is that so? I used to know a nephew of his, but I've rather lost touch. Never had the privilege of meeting the great man, though. And not only Mr. Churchill," Mrs. Smith went on. "He knows Mr. Eden and Lord Halifax. Really?" I could sense the doctor's eyes examining me closely. I was about to make some appropriate remark, but before I could do so, Strander said to the doctor, "Is that so? Indeed." "Yeah, I could do so," Mr. Andrews said to the doctor. "Gentleman was just telling us he's had a lot to do with foreign affairs in his time." is that so indeed? It seemed to me that Dr. Carlyle went on looking at me for an inordinate length of time. Then he regained his cheerful manner and asked, "Touring around for pleasure?" "Principally," I said, and gave a small laugh. "Well, you have nice country around here. Oh, by the way, Mr. Andrews, I'm sorry not to have returned the saw yet." "No hurry at all, Doctor." For a little time, the focus of attention left me, and I was able to remain silent. Then, seizing what seemed a suitable moment, I rose to my feet, saying, "Please excuse me, it has been a most enjoyable evening, but I really must now retire." "Such a pity you have to retire already, sir," Miss Smith said. "The doctor's only just arrived." Mr. Harry Smith leaned across his wife and said to Dr. Carlyle, "I was hoping the gentleman would have a few words to say about your ideas on the Empire, Doctor." Then turning to me, he went on, "Our doctor hears for all kinds of little countries going independent. I don't have the learning to prove him wrong, though I know he is." Ah, サリーさん来てくれてありがとう。テロンちゃんのスタンプだね。パッと来てくれてありがとう。今日はゆっくり本読んでます。よければ一緒に本の読みをくださいね。I don't have the learning to prove him wrong, though I know he is. But I have been interested to hear what the likes of yourself would have to say to him on the subject, sir. Yet again, Dr. Carlyle's gaze seemed to study me. Then he said, "A pity, but we must let the gentleman go off to bed. Had a tiring day, I expect." "Indeed," I said, and with another small laugh began to make my way around the table. To my embarrassment, everyone in the room, including Dr. Carlyle, rose to their feet. "Thank you all very much," I said, smiling. "Mrs. Taylor, I did enjoy a splendid summer. I wish you all a very good night." A very good night. There came a chorus of "Good night, sir," in reply. I had almost left the room when the doctor's voice caused me to halt at the door. "I say, old chap," he said, and when I turned, I saw he had remained on his feet. "I have a visit to make in Stanbury first thing in the morning. I'd be happy to give you a lift up to your car. Save you the walk, and we can pick up a can of petrol from Ted Hardacre's on the way." "This is most kind," I said, "but I don't wish to put you to any trouble." "No trouble at all, sir. 7:30 all right for you?" "That would be most helpful indeed. Right then, 7:30 it is. Make sure your guest's up and breakfasted for 7:30, Mrs. Taylor." Then turning back to me, he added, "So we can have our talk after all. Though Harry here won't have the satisfaction of witnessing my humiliation." There was laughter and another exchange of good nights before I was at last allowed to ascend to the sanctuary of this room. I trust I need hardly... あ、ロンしてね。ありがとう。チャネルを使ってくれてありがとう。それじゃあ... I trust I need hardly underline the extent of the discomfort I suffered tonight on account of the unfortunate misunderstanding concerning my person. I can only say now that in all honesty I fail to see how I might reasonably have prevented the situation developing as it did, for by this stage I had become aware of what was occurring things had gone so far I could not have enlightened these people without creating much embarrassment all around. In any case, regrettable as the whole business was, I do not see that any real harm has been done. I will, after all, take my leave of these people in the morning and presumably never encounter them again. There seems little point in dwelling on the matter. However, the unfortunate misunderstanding aside, there are perhaps one or two other aspects to this evening's events which warrant a few moments' thought, if only because otherwise they may come to niggle one throughout the coming days. For instance, there is the matter of Mr. Harry Smith's pronouncements on the nature of dignity. There is surely little in his statements that merits serious consideration. Of course, one has to allow that Mr. Harry Smith was employing the word dignity in a quite different sense altogether from my own understanding of it. Even so, even taken on their own terms, his statements were surely far too idealistic or far too theoretical to deserve respect. Up to a point, no doubt, there is some truth in what he says. In a country such as ours, people may indeed have a certain duty to think about great affairs and form their opinions. But life being what it is, how can ordinary people truly be expected to have strong opinions on all manner of things? As Mr. Harry Smith rather fancifully claims, the villagers here do. And not only are these expectations unrealistic, I rather doubt if they are even desirable. There is, after all, a real limit to how much ordinary people can learn and know, and to demand that each and every one of them contribute strong opinions to the great debates of the nation cannot surely be wise. It is in any case absurd that anyone should presume to define a person's dignity in these terms. As it happens, there is an instance that comes to mind which I believe illustrates rather well the real limits of whatever truth may be contained in Mr. Harry Smith's views. It is, as it happens, an instance from my own experience, an episode that took place before the war around 1935. As I recall, I was rung for late one night. It was past midnight. In the drawing room where his lordship had been entertaining three gentlemen since dinner. I had naturally been called to the drawing room several times already that night to replenish refreshments, and had observed on these occasions that gentlemen deep in conversation over weighty issues. When I entered the drawing room on this last occasion, however, all the gentlemen stopped talking and looked at me, and his lordship said, "Step this way a moment, will you, Stevens? Mr. Spencer here wishes a word with you." The gentleman in question went on gazing at me for a moment without changing the somewhat languid posture he had adopted in his armchair. Then he said, "My good man, I have a question for you. We need your help on a certain matter we've been debating. Tell me, do you suppose the debt situation regarding America is a significant factor in the present low levels of trade? Or do you suppose this is a red herring and that the abandonment of the gold standard is at the root of the matter?" I was naturally a little surprised by this, but then quickly saw the situation for what it was. That is to say, it was clearly expected that I be baffled by the question. Indeed, in the moment or so that it took for me to perceive this and compose a suitable response, I may even have given the outward impression of struggling with the question, for I saw all the gentlemen in the room exchange mirthful smiles. "I'm very sorry, sir," I said, "but I am unable to be of assistance on this matter." I was by this point well on top of the situation, but the gentleman went on laughing covertly. Then Mr. Spencer said, "Then perhaps you will help us on another matter. Would you say the currency problem in Europe would be made better or worse if there were to be an arms agreement between the French and the Bolsheviks. I'm sorry, sir, but I'm unable to be of assistance on this matter. Oh dear, said Mr. Spencer, so you can't help us here either. There was more suppressed laughter before his lordship said, Very well, Stevens, that will be all. Please, Darlington, I have one more question to put to our good man here. Mr. Spencer said, I very much wanted his help on the question presently vexing many of us and which we all realize is crucial on how we should shape our foreign policy. My good fellow, please come to our assistance. What was M. Lowell really intending by his recent speech on the situation in North Africa? Were you also of the view that it was simply a ruse to scupper the nationalist fringe of his own domestic party? I'm sorry, sir, but I am unable to assist in this matter. You see, gentlemen, Mr. Spencer said, turning to the others, our man here is unable to assist us in these matters. This brought fresh laughter, now barely suppressed. And yet, Mr. Spencer went on, we still persist with the notion that this nation's decisions be left in the hands of our good man here, and in the few million others like him. Is it any wonder, saddled as we are with our present parliamentary system, that we are unable to find any solution to our many difficulties? Why, you may as well ask a committee of mothers union to organize a war campaign. There was an open, hearty laughter at this remark, and during which his lordship mentioned, Thank you, Stevens, thus enabling me to take my leave. While, of course, this was a slightly uncomfortable situation, it was hardly the most difficult, or even an especially unusual one, to encounter in the course of one's duties. You will no doubt agree that any decent professional should expect to take such events in this stride. I had then all but forgotten the episode by the following morning, when Lord Darlington came into the billiard room while I was up on a step-ladder dusting portraits, and said, Look here, Stevens, it was dreadful, the ordeal we put you through last night. I paused in what I was doing and said, Not at all, sir, I was only too happy to be of service. It was quite dreadful. We'd all had rather too good a dinner, I fancy, perhaps. Please accept my apologies. Thank you, sir, but I am happy to assure you I was not unduly inconvenienced. His lordship walked over rather wearily to a leather armchair, seated himself inside. From my vantage point up on my ladder, I could see practically the whole of his long figure caught in the winter sunshine, pouring in through the French windows and streaking much of the room. It was, as I recall it, one of those moments that brought home how much the pressures of life had taken their toll on his lordship over a relatively small number of years. His frame, always slender, had become alarmingly thin and somewhat misshapen, his hair prematurely white, his face strained and haggard. For a while he sat gazing out of the French windows towards the downs, and said again, It really was quite dreadful, but you see, Stevens, Mr. Spencer had a point to prove to Sir Leonard. In fact, if it is any consolation, you did assist in demonstrating a very important point. Sir Leonard had been talking a lot of that old-fashioned nonsense about the will of the people being the wisest arbitrator and so on. Would you believe it, Stevens? Indeed, sir. We're really so slow in this country to recognize when a thing's outmoded. Other great nations know full well that to meet the challenges of each new age means discarding old, sometimes well-loved methods. Not so here in Britain. There's still so many talking like Sir Leonard last night. That's why Mr. Spencer felt the need to demonstrate his point. And I tell you, Stevens, if the likes of Sir Leonard are made to wake up and think a little, then you can take it from me, your ordeal last night was not in vain. Indeed, sir. Lord Darlington gave another sigh. We're always the last, Stevens, always the last to be clinging on to outmoded systems. But sooner or later, we'll need to face up to the facts. Democracy is something for a bygone era. The world's far too complicated a place now for universal suffrage and such like. For endless members of parliament debating things to a standstill. All fine a few years ago, perhaps, but in today's world? What was it Mr. Spencer said last night? Put it rather well. I believe, sir, he compared the present parliamentary system to a committee of the Mothers' Union, attempting to organize a war campaign. Exactly, Stevens. We are quite frankly behind the times in this country, and it's imperative that all forward-looking people impress this upon the likes of Sir Leonard. Indeed, sir. I ask you, Stevens. Here we are in the midst of a continuing crisis. I've seen it with my own eyes when I went north with Mr. Whittaker. People are suffering. Ordinary, decent, working people are suffering terribly. Germany and Italy have set their houses in order by acting, and so have the wretched Bolsheviks in their own way, one supposes. Even President Roosevelt, look at him. He's not afraid to take a few bold steps on behalf of his people. But look at us here, Stevens. Year after year goes by and nothing gets better. All we do is argue and debate and procrastinate. Any decent idea is amended to ineffectuality by the time it's gone halfway through the various committees it's obliged to pass through. The few people qualified to know what are talked to a standstill by ignorant people all around them. What do you make of it, Stevens? The nation does seem to be in a regrettable condition, sir. I'll say, look at Germany and Italy, Stevens. See what strong leadership can do if it's allowed to act. None of this universal suffrage nonsense there. If your house is on fire, you don't call the household into the drawing room and debate the various options for escape for an hour, do you? It may have been all very well once, but the world's a complicated place now. The man in the street can't be expected to know. 英語上手かなありがとう、サリさん。日本語は上手かなこんなにペラペラ読めないね。ただ、読み上げが入れてるだけで生き取れるから、ちゃんと理解できる。それじゃなくたら、読む時間が4、5倍になるね。さあ、どこだったっけIt may have been all very well once, but the world's a complicated place now. Man in the street can't be expected to know enough about politics, on economics, and world commerce, and what have you. And why should he? In fact, you made a very good reply last night, Stevens. How did he put it? Something to the effect that it was not in your realm? Well, why should it be? It occurs to me in recalling these words that, of course, many of Lord Darlington's ideas will seem today rather odd, even at times unattractive. But surely it cannot be denied that there is an important element of truth in these things. He said to me that morning in the billiard room. Of course, it is quite absurd to expect any butler to be in a position to answer authoritatively questions of the sort Mr. Spencer had put to me that night. And the claim of people like Mr. Harry Smith that one's dignity is conditional on being able to do so can be seen for the nonsense it is. Let us establish this quite clearly. A butler's duty is to provide good service. It is not to meddle in the great affairs of the nation. The fact is, such great affairs will always be beyond the understanding of those such as you and I. And those of us who wish to make our mark must realize that we best do so by concentrating on what is within our realm, that is to say, by devoting our attention to providing the best possible service to those great gentlemen, in whose hands the destiny of civilization truly lies. This may seem obvious, but then one can immediately think of too many instances of butlers who, for a time anyway, thought quite differently. Indeed, Mr. Harry Smith's words tonight remind me very much of the sort of misguided idealism which beset significant sections of our generation throughout the 20s and 30s. I refer to that strand of opinion in the profession which suggested that any butler with serious aspirations should make it his business to be forever reappraising his employer, scrutinizing the latter's motives, analyzing the implications of his views. Only in this way, so the argument ran, would one be sure one's skills were being employed to a desirable end. Although one sympathizes to some extent with the idealism contained in such an argument, there can be little doubt that it is the result, like Mr. Smith's sentiments tonight, of misguided thinking. One need only look at the butlers who attempted to put such an approach into practice, and one will see that their careers, and in some cases they were highly promising careers, came to nothing as a direct consequence. I personally knew at least two professionals, both of some ability, who went from one employer to the next, forever dissatisfied, never settling anywhere, until they drifted from view altogether. That this should happen is not in the least surprising, for it is in practice simply not possible to adopt such a critical attitude towards an employer, and at the same time provide good service. It is not simply that one is unlikely to be able to meet the many demands of service. Service at the higher levels, while one's attentions are being diverted by such matters. More fundamentally, a butler who is forever attempting to formulate his own strong opinions on his employer's affairs is bound to lack one quality essential to all good professions, namely loyalty. Please do not misunderstand me here. I do not refer to the mindless sort of loyalty the mediocre employers bemoan the lack of when they find themselves unable to obtain the services of high-caliber professionals. Indeed, I would be among the last to advocate bestowing one's loyalty carelessly to any lady or gentleman who happens to employ one for a time. However, if a butler is to be of any worth to anything or anybody in life, there must surely come a time when he ceases his searching. A time when he must say to himself, "This employer, what is all that I find noble and admirable, I will hereafter devote myself to serving him." This is loyalty intelligently bestowed. What is there undignified in this? One is simply accepting an inescapable truth, that the likes of you and I will never be in a position to comprehend the great affairs of today's world, and our best course will always be to put our trust in an employer we judge to be wise and honorable, and to devote our energies to the task of serving him to the best of our ability. Look at the likes of Mr. Marshall, say, or Mr. Lane, surely two of the greatest figures in our profession. Can we imagine Mr. Marshall arguing with Lord Camberley, or the latter's latest dispatch to the Foreign Office? Do we admire Mr. Lane any the less because we learn that he is not in the habit of challenging Sir Leonard Grey before each speech in the House of Commons? Of course we do not. What is there undignified? What is there at all culpable in such an attitude? How can one possibly be held to blame in any sense because, say, the passage of time has shown that Lord Darlington's affairs were misguided, even foolish, throughout the years I served him? It was he and he alone who weighed up evidence and judged it best to proceed in the way he did, while I simply confined myself quite properly to affairs within my own professional realm. And as far as I'm concerned, I carried out my duties to the best of my abilities, indeed to a standard which many may consider first-rate. It is hardly my fault if his lordship's life and work turned out today to look, at best, a sad waste, and it is quite illogical that I should feel any regret or shame on my own account. Day 4, afternoon. I have finally, Little Compton, Cornwall. I have finally arrived in Little Compton, and at this moment I'm sitting in the dining hall of the Rose Garden Hotel, having recently finished lunch. Outside, the ruin is falling steadily. The Rose Garden Hotel, while hardly luxurious, is certainly homely and comfortable, and one cannot begrudge the extra expense of accommodating oneself here. It is conveniently situated on one corner of the village square, a rather charming ivy-covered manor house, capable of housing, I would suppose, 30 or so guests. This dining hall where I now sit, however, is a modern annex built to adjoin the main building. A long, flat room characterized by rows of large windows on either side. On one side the village square is visible, on the other the rear garden, from which the establishment presumably takes its name. The garden, which seems well sheltered from the wind, has a number of tables arranged about it, and when the weather is fine I imagine it is a very pleasant place to partake of meals or refreshments. In fact, I know that a little earlier some guests had actually commenced lunch out there, only to be interrupted by the appearance of ominous storm clouds. When I was first shown in here, an hour or so ago, staff were hurriedly stripping down the garden tables. While the recent occupants, including one gentleman with a napkin still tucked into his shirt, was standing about looking rather lost. Then very soon afterwards the rain had come down with such ferocity that for a moment all the guests seemed to stop eating just to stare out of the windows. My own table is on the village square side of the room, and I have thus spent much of the past hour watching the rain fall on the square, and upon the ford and one or two other vehicles stationed outside. The rain has now steadied somewhat, but it is still sufficiently hard as to discourage one from going out and wandering around the village. Of course, the possibility has occurred to me that I might set off now to meet Miss Kenton, but then in my letter I informed her I would be calling at 3 o'clock, and I do not think it would be wise to surprise her by arriving any earlier. It would seem quite likely then, if the rain does not cease very shortly, that I will remain here. あ、美味しいご飯食べてね。気をつけてね、サリさん。また、そこで赤色はもうあった。で、何かやってる時、お会いしましょう。じゃあまた。どこ行ったっけ？ I will remain here drinking until the proper time comes for me to set off. I have ascertained from the young woman serving lunch that the address where Miss Kenton is presently residing is some 15 minutes' walk away, which implies I have at least another 40 minutes to wait. I should say, incidentally, that I am not so foolish as to be unprepared for disappointment. I'm only too aware that I received a reply from Miss me she would be happy about a meeting. However, knowing Miss Kenton as I do, I am inclined to think that a lack of any letter can be taken as a dream, or a meeting for any reason. I feel sure that she would not have hesitated to inform me. Moreover, I have stated in my letter that the fact that I had made a reservation at this hotel, that any last-minute message could be left for me here, that no such message was awaiting me can, I believe, be taken as further reason to suppose all is well. This present downpour is something of a surprise. Since the day started with the bright morning sunshine, I have been blessed with each morning since leaving Darlington. In fact, the day had generally begun well, with a breakfast of fresh farm eggs and toast, provided for me by Mrs. Taylor, and with Dr. Carlyle calling by at 7:30 as promised, I was able to take my leave of the Taylors, who continued not to hear of remuneration. Before any further embarrassing conversation had a chance to develop, I found a can of petrol for you, Carlyle announced, as he ushered me into the passenger seat of his Rover. I thanked him for his thoughtfulness, but when I made inquiries as to payment, I found that he too would hear none of it. Nonsense, old boy. It's only a little bit I found at the back of my garage, but it'll be enough for you to reach Crosby Gate, and you can fill up good and proper there. The village center of Moscow in the morning sunshine could be seen to be a number of small The village center of Moscow in the morning sunshine could be seen to be a number of small shops surrounding a church, the steeple of which I had seen from the hill yesterday evening. I had little chance to study the village, however, for Dr. Carlyle turned his car briskly into the driveway of a farmland. Just a little shortcut, he said, as we made our way past barns and stationary farm vehicles. There seemed to be no persons present anywhere, and at one point, when we were confronted by a closed gate, the doctor said, "Sorry, old chap, but if you wouldn't mind doing the honors." Getting out, I went to the gate, and as soon as I did so, a furious chorus of barking erupted in one of the barns nearby, so that it was with some relief that I rejoined Dr. Carlyle again in the front of his room. We exchanged a few pleasantries as we climbed a narrow road between tall trees, he inquiring after how I had slept at the tailor's and so forth. Then he said quite abruptly, "I say, I hope you don't think me very rude, but you aren't a manservant of some sort, are you?" I must confess my overwhelming feeling on hearing this was one of relief. "I am, dear sir. I am, in fact, the butler of Darlington Hall near Oxford." "Thought so." All that about having met Winston Churchill and so on. I thought to myself, well, either the chap's been lying his head off, but then it occurred to me that there's one simple explanation. Dr. Carlyle turned to me with a smile as he continued to steer the car up the steep, winding road. I said, "It wasn't my intention to deceive anyone, sir. However, Oh, no need to explain, old fellow. I can quite see how it happened. I mean to say, you are a pretty impressive specimen. The likes of the people here, they bound to mistake you for at least a lord or duke." The doctor gave a hearty laugh. "Must do one good to be mistaken for a lord every now and then." We travelled on in silence for a few moments. Then Dr. Carlyle said to me, "Well, I hope you enjoyed your life, a little stay with us here." "I did very much, thank you, sir." "What did you make of the citizens of Moscow? Not such a bad bunch, are they?" "Very engaging, sir. Mr. and Mrs. Taylor were extremely kind." "I wish you wouldn't call me sir like that all the time, Mr. Stevens." No, they're not such a bad bunch all around here. At all around here. As far as I'm concerned, I'd happily spend the rest of my life out here. I thought I heard something slightly odd in the way Dr. Carlyle said this. It was too curiously deliberate as to the way he went on to her again. So you found them an engaging bunch, eh? Indeed, Doctor, extremely congenial. So what were they all telling you about last night? Oh, they didn't bore you silly with all the village gossip. Not at all, Doctor, as a matter of fact. The conversations tended to be rather earnest in tone and some very interesting viewpoints were expressed. Oh, you mean Harry Smith? The doctor said with a laugh. You shouldn't mind him. He's entertaining enough to listen to for a while, but really, he's all in a muddle. At times you'd think he was some sort of communist. Then he comes out with something that makes him sound true blue Tory. Truth is, he's all in a muddle. Oh, that is very interesting to hear. What did he lecture you on last night? The Empire? The national health? Mr. Smith restricted himself to more general topics. Oh, for instance, I gave a cough. Mr. Smith had some thoughts on the nature of dignity. I say, now that sounds rather philosophical for Harry Smith. How the devil did he get on to that? I believe Mr. Smith was stressing the importance of his campaigning work in the village. Ah yes, he was impressing upon me the point that the residents of Moscow held strong opinions on all manner of great affairs. Ah yes, sounds like Harry Smith. As you probably guessed, that's all nonsense. Of course, Harry's always going around trying to work everybody up over issues, but the truth is, people are happier left alone. We were silent again for a moment or two. Eventually, I said, "Excuse me for asking, sir, but may I take it Mr. Smith is considered something of a comic figure?" That's taking it a little too far, I'd say. People do have a political conscience of sorts here. They feel they ought to have strong feelings on this, and then isn't that just as Harry urges them to? But really, they're no different from people anywhere. They want a quiet life. Harry has a lot of ideas about changes to this and that. Really, no one in the village wants upheaval, even if it might benefit them. People here want to be left alone to lead their quiet little lives. They don't want to be bothered with this issue and that issue. I was surprised by the tone of disgust that had entered the doctor's voice, but he recovered himself quite quickly with a short laugh and remarked, "Nice view of the village on your side." Indeed, the village had suddenly become some way below us. Nice view of the village on your side. Indeed, the village had become visible some way below us. Of course, the morning sunshine gave it a very different aspect, but otherwise it looked much the same view as the one I had first encountered in the evening gloom. And I suppose from this that we were now close to the spot where I had left the ford. Mr. Smith seemed to be of the view, I said, that a person's dignity rested on such things, having strong opinions and such. あは。そうだよね。 Ah, yes, dignity. I was forgetting. Yes. So Harry was trying to tackle philosophical questions. My word, I take it. It was a lot of rot. His conclusions were not necessarily those that compelled agreement, sir. Dr. Carlyle nodded, but seemed to have become immersed in his own thoughts. You know, Mr. Stephen, he said eventually. When I first came out here, I was a committed socialist. Believed in the best services for all the people and all the rest of it. First came here in 49. Socialism would allow people to live with dignity. That's what I believed when I came out here. Or you don't want to hear all this, Rod. He turned to me cheerily. What about you, old chap? I'm sorry, sir. What do you think dignity's all about? The directness of his inquiry did, I admit, take me rather by surprise, but it's rather a hard thing to explain in a few words, sir. But I suspect it comes down to not removing one's clothing in public. Sorry, what does? Dignity, sir. Ah! The doctor nodded, but looked a little bemused. Then he said, now, this road should be familiar to you. Probably looks rather different in daylight. Ah, is that it there? My goodness, what a handsome vehicle. Dr. Carlyle pulled up just behind the Ford, got out and yet. My, what a handsome vehicle. The next moment he had produced a funnel and a can of petrol. Was most kindly assisting me in filling the tank of the Ford. Any fears I had that some deeper trouble was afoot were laid to rest when I tried the ignition. I heard the engine come to life with a healthy murmur. At this point, I thanked Dr. Carlyle and we took leave of each other, though I was obliged to follow the back of his rover along a twisting hill road for a further mile or so before our routes separated. It was around 9 o'clock that I crossed the border into Cornwall. This was at least 3 hours before the rain began and the clouds were still all of a brilliant white. In fact, many of the sights that greeted me this morning among the most charming I have so far encountered. It was unfortunate then that I could not for much of the time give to them the attention that it warranted. For one may as well declare one was in a condition of some preoccupation with the thought that, barring some unseen complication, one would be meeting Miss Kenton again before the day's end. So it was then that while speeding along between large open fields, no human being or vehicle apparent for miles, or else steering carefully through marvelous little villages, some no more than a cluster of a few stone cottages. I found myself yet again turning over certain recollections from the past. And now, as I sit here in Little Compton, here in the dining room of this pleasant hotel, with a little time on my hands, watching the rain splashing on the pavements of the village square outside, I am unable to prevent my mind from beginning to wander along these some tracks. One memory in particular has preoccupied me all morning, or rather a fragment of a memory. A moment that has for some reason remained with me vividly for the years. It is a recollection of standing alone in the dark, the back corner, or the closed door of Miss Kenton's parlor. I was not actually facing the door, but standing with my person half turned towards it, transfixed by the indecision as to whether or not I should knock. For at that moment, as I recall, I had been struck by the conviction that behind that very door, just a few yards from me, Miss Kenton was in fact crying. As I say, this moment remained firmly embedded in my mind, as has the memory of the peculiar sensation I felt rising within me, as I stood there like that. However, I am not at all certain now as to the actual circumstances which had led me to be standing thus in the back corridor. It occurs to me that elsewhere in attempting to gather such recollections, I may well have asserted this memory derived from the minutes immediately after Hinton receiving news of her aunt's death. That is to say, the occasion when, having left her to be alone with her grief, I realized out in the corridor that I had not offered offered her my condolences. But now, having thought further, I believe I have been a little confused about this matter. That in fact this fragment of memory derives from events that took place on an evening at least a few months after the death of Miss Kenton's aunt. The evening, in fact, when the young Mr. Cardinal turned up at Darlington Hall rather unexpectedly. Mr. Cardinal's father, Sir David Cardinal, had been for many years his lordship's closest friend and colleague, but had been tragically killed in a riding accident some 3 or 4 years prior to the evening I am now recalling. Meanwhile, the young Mr. Cardinal had been building something of a name for himself as a columnist specializing in witty comments on international affairs. ちょっと広告入りますね。ただいま広告から。Evidently, these columns were rarely to Lord Darlington's liking, for I can recall numerous instances of his looking up from a journal and saying something like, "Young Reggie writing such nonsense again. Just as well his father's not alive to read this." But Mr. Cardinal's columns did not prevent him from being a frequent visitor at the house. Indeed, his lordship never forgot that the young man was his godson and always treated him as kin. At the same time, it had never been Mr. Cardinal's habit to turn up to dinner without any prior warning, and I was thus a little surprised when, on answering the door that evening, I found him standing there, his briefcase cradled in both arms. "Oh, hello, Stevens. How are you?" he said. "Just happened to be in a bit of a jam tonight and wondered if Lord Darlington would put me up for the night." "It's very nice to see you again, sir. I shall tell his lordship you are here. I'd intended to stay at Mr. Rowland's place, but there seems to have been some misunderstanding, and they've gone away somewhere. Hope it's not too inconvenient a time to call. I mean, nothing special on tonight, is there?" "I believe, sir, his lordship is expecting some gentleman to call after dinner." "Oh, that's bad luck. I seem to have chosen a bad night. I'd better keep my head no. I've got some pieces I have to work on tonight anyway." Mr. Cardinal indicated his briefcase. "I shall tell his lordship you are here, sir. You are in any case in good time to join him for dinner?" "Jolly good. I was hoping I might have been. But I don't expect Mrs. Mortimer's going to be very pleased with me." I left Mr. Cardinal in the drawing room and made my way to the study, where I found his lordship working through some pages with a look of deep concentration. When I told him of Mr. Cardinal's arrival, a look of surprised annoyance crossed us. Then he leaned back in his chair as though puzzling something out. "Tell Mr. Cardinal I'll be down shortly," he said finally. "He can amuse himself for a little while." When I returned downstairs, I discovered Mr. Cardinal moving rather restlessly around the drawing room, something objects he must long ago have become familiar with. I conveyed his lordship's message and asked him what refreshments I would bring him. "Oh, just some tea for now, Stevens. What's his lordship expecting tonight?" "I'm sorry, sir. I'm afraid I'm unable to help you." "No idea at all." "I'm sorry, sir." Curious. Oh well, better keep my head low tonight." It was not long after this, I recall, that I went down to Miss Kenton's parlour. She was sitting at her table, though there was nothing before her, and her hands were empty indeed. Something in her demeanour suggested that she had been sitting there like that for some time prior to my knocking. "Mr. Cardinal is here, Miss Kenton," I said. "Will be requiring the usual room tonight?" "Very good, Mr. Stevens. I shall see to it before I leave." "Ah, you are going out this evening, Miss Kenton?" "I am indeed, Mr. Stevens." "Mr. Stevens." Perhaps I look a little surprised, for he went on. "You will recall, Mr. Stevens, we discussed this a fortnight ago." "Yes, of course, Miss Kenton. I beg your pardon. It had just slipped my mind for a moment." "Is something the matter, Mr. Stevens?" "Not at all, Miss Kenton. Some visitors are expected this evening, but there is no reason why your presence will be required. We did agree to my taking this evening off a fortnight ago, Mr. Stevens." "Of course, Miss Kenton. I do beg your pardon." I turned to leave, but then I was halted on the door by Miss Kenton saying, "Mr. Stevens, I have something to tell you." "Yes, Miss Kenton." "It concerns my acquaintance who I'm going to meet tonight." "Yes, Miss Kenton." "He has asked me to marry him. I thought you had a right to know that." "Indeed, Miss Kenton, that is very interesting. I am giving the matter thought." "Indeed." She glanced down a second at her hands, but then almost immediately her gaze returned to me. "My acquaintance is to start a job in the West Country as of next month." "Indeed." "As I say, Mr. Stevens, I am still giving the matter some thought. However, I thought you should be informed of the situation." "I am very grateful, Miss Kenton. I do hope you have a pleasant evening. Now, if you will excuse me." It must have been 20 minutes or so later that I encountered Miss Kenton again. This time, while I was busy with preparations for dinner. In fact, I was halfway up the back staircase, carrying a fully laden tray, when I heard the sound of angry footsteps rattling the floorboards somewhat below me. Turning, I saw Miss Kenton glaring up at me from the foot of the stairs. Mr. Stevens, do I understand that you are wishing me to remain on duty this evening? Not at all, Miss Kenton. As you pointed out, you did notify me some time ago, but I can see you are very unhappy about my going out tonight. On the contrary, Miss Kenton, do you imagine that by creating so much commotion in the kitchen and by stamping that floor like this outside my parlor, you will get me to change my mind? Miss Kenton, the slight excitement in the kitchen is solely on account of Mr. Cardinal coming to dinner at the last moment. There is absolutely no reason why you should not go out this evening. I intend to go with or without your blessing, Mr. Stevens. I wish to make this clear. I made arrangements weeks ago. Indeed, Miss Kenton, and once again I would wish you a very... あ、こんばんは、ひーちゃん。来てくれてありがとう。今日はまったり本読んでる。ただ、聞いてもらえると嬉しい。今は、ちょっと、とある羊の身の残りを語っているその羊そのものです。その話を読んでいます。I would wish... はい。ありがとう。その褒め言葉、そのまま受けてもらう。At dinner, an odd atmosphere seemed to hang in the air between the two gentlemen. For そうかもね。でも頑張ってますね。もっと頑張って。英語上手ですねと教えてください。いやでも頑張ってるだけで嬉しい。いや嬉しいかもね。でも日本語で話せるから大丈夫ですよ。At dinner, an odd atmosphere seemed to hang in the air between the two gentlemen. For long moments they are in silence, his lordship in particular seeming very far away. At one point, Mr. Cardinal said, "Something special tonight, sir." Eh? No visitors this evening. Special? Afraid I can't tell you, my boy. Strictly confidential. Oh dear, I suppose this means I should sit in on it. Sit in on what, my boy? Whatever it is that's going to take place tonight. Oh, it wouldn't be of any interest to you. In any case, confidentiality is of the utmost. I can't have someone like you around. Oh no, that wouldn't do at all. Oh dear, this does sound very special. Mr. Cardinal was watching his lordship very keenly, but the latter simply went back to his food without saying anything further. The gentleman retired to the smoking room for port and cigars, in the course of clearing the dining room, and also in preparing the drawing room for the arrival of the evening's visitors. I was obliged to walk repeatedly past the smoking room doors. It was inevitable, then, that I would notice how the gentlemen, in contrast to their quiet mood at dinner, had begun to exchange words with some urgency. A quarter of an hour later, angry voices were being raised. Of course, I did not stop to listen, but I could not avoid hearing his lordship shouting, "That's not your business, my boy. That's not your business." I was in the dining room when the gentlemen eventually came out. They seemed to have calmed themselves. The only words exchanged as they walked across the hall were his lordship's. "Now remember, my boy, I'm trusting you," to which Mr. Cardinal muttered with irritation, "Yes, yes, you have my word." Then their footsteps separated, his lordship's going towards his study, Mr. Cardinal's towards the library. At almost precisely 8:30, there came the sound of motor cars pulling up in the courtyard. I opened the doors to a chauffeur, and past his shoulders I could see some police constables dispersing to various points of the grounds. The next moment I was showing in two very distinguished gentlemen, who were met by his lordship in the hall, and ushered quickly into the drawing room. 10 minutes or so later came the sound of another car, and I opened the door to Herr Ribbentrop, the German ambassador, by now no stranger to Darlington Hall. His lordship emerged to meet him, and the two gentlemen appeared to exchange complicit glances before disappearing altogether into the drawing room. When a few moments later I was called in to provide refreshments, the four gentlemen were discussing the relative merits of different sorts of sausage, and the atmosphere seemed, and on the surface at least, quite convivial. Thereafter I took up my position out in the hall, the position near the entrance arch that I customarily took up during important meetings. I was not obliged to move from it again until some 2 hours later, when the back door bell was rung. On descending, I discovered a police constable standing there with Miss Kenton, requesting that I verify the latter's identity. Just security, miss. No offense meant. The officer muttered as he wandered off again into the night. ここでちょっと休憩してトイレ行きますね。少々お待ちください。 ただいま。そうですね。聞き取れるようになったら、もっと楽しめる。いいちゃん、またね。ピー、ピー。かわいい。それじゃあ、本読んで、どこでAs I was bolting the door, I noticed Miss Kenton waiting for me and said, I trust you had a pleasant evening, Miss Kenton. She made no reply, so I said again, as we were making our way across the darkened expanse of the kitchen floor. I trust you had a pleasant evening, Miss Kenton. I did. Thank you, Mr. Stevens. I'm pleased to hear that. Behind me. あ、すみやさん、来てくれてありがとう。いつも。ロンも了解。Behind me, Miss Kenton's footsteps came to a sudden halt, and I heard her say, Are you not in the least interested in what took place tonight between acquaintance and I, Mr. Stevens? I do not mean to be rude, Miss Kenton, but I really must return upstairs without further delay. The fact is, events of a global significance are taking place in this house at this very moment. When are they not, Mr. Stevens? Very well, if you must be rushing off, I shall just tell you that I accepted my acquaintance's proposal. I beg your pardon, Miss Kenton. His proposal of marriage. Ah, is that so, Miss Kenton? Then may I offer you my congratulations? Thank you, Mr. Stevens. Of course, I will be happy to serve out my notice. However, should it be that you are able to release me earlier, we would be very grateful. My acquaintance begins his new job in the West Country in 2 weeks' time. I will do my best to secure a replacement at the earliest opportunity, Miss Kenton. Now, if you will excuse me, I must return upstairs. I started to walk away again, but then, when I had all but reached the doors to the corridor, I heard Miss Kenton say, Mr. Stevens, and thus turned once more. She had not moved, and consequently she was obliged to raise her voice slightly in addressing me, so that it resonated rather oddly in the cavernous spaces of the dark and empty kitchen. Am I to take it, she said, that after the many years of service I have given to this house, you have no more words to greet the news of my possible departure than those you have just uttered? Miss Kenton, you have my warmest congratulations, but I repeat, there are matters of global significance taking place upstairs, and I must return to my post. Did you know, Mr. Stevens, that you have been a very important figure for my acquaintance and I? Really, Miss Kenton? Yes, Mr. Stevens, we often pass the time amusing ourselves with anecdotes about you, for instance. My acquaintance is always wanting me to show him the way you pinch your nostrils together when you put pepper. That always gets him laughing. Indeed, he's also rather fond of your staff pep talks. I must say I've become quite expert in recreating them. I only have to do a few lines to have the pair of us in stitches. Indeed, Miss Kenton, now you will please excuse me. I ascended to the hall and took up my position again. However, before 5 minutes had passed, Mr. Cardinal appeared in the doorway at the library and beckoned me over. Hate to bother you, Stevens, he said, but I couldn't trouble you to fetch a little more brandy, could I? The bottle you brought in earlier appears to be finished. You are very welcome to whatever refreshments you care for, sir. However, in view of the fact that you have your column to complete, I wonder if it is entirely wise to partake further. My column will be fine, Stevens. Do get me a little more brandy. There's a good fellow. Very well, sir. When I returned to the library a moment later, Mr. Cardinal was wandering around the shelves, scrutinizing spines. I could see papers scattered untidily over one of the writing desks nearby. As I approached, Mr. Cardinal made an appreciative sound and slumped down into a leather armchair. I went over to him, poured a little brandy, and handed it to him. "You know, Mr. Stevens," he said, "we've been friends for some time now, haven't we?" "Indeed, sir. I always look forward to a little chat with you whenever I come here." "Yes, sir. Won't you care to join me in a little drink?" "That's very kind of you, sir, but..." "No, thank you. I won't." "I say, Stevens, are you all right there?" "Perfectly all right, thank you, sir," I said with a small laugh. "Feeling unwell, are you?" "A little tired, perhaps, but I'm perfectly fine, thank you, sir." "Well then, you should sit down. Anyway, as I was saying, we've been friends for some time. I really ought to be truthful with you. As you no doubt guessed, I didn't happen to by tonight just by accident. I had a tip-off, you see, about what's going on over there across the hall at this very moment." "Yes, sir." "I do wish you'd sit down, Stevens. I want us to talk as friends. You're standing there holding that blasted tray looking like you're about to wander off any second." "I'm sorry, sir." I put down my tray and seated myself in an appropriate posture. On the armchair Mr. Cardinal was indicating. "That's better," Mr. Cardinal said. "Now, Stevens, I don't suppose the Prime Minister is presently in the drawing room, is he?" "The Prime Minister, sir?" "Oh, it's all right. You don't have to tell me. I understand you're in a tricky position." Mr. Cardinal heaved a sigh and looked wearily towards his paper scattered over the desk. Then he said, "I hardly need to tell you, do I, Stevens, what I feel towards his lordship? I mean to say, he's been like a second father to me. I hardly need to tell you, Stevens." "No, sir. I care deeply for him." "Yes, sir. And I know you do too, care deeply for him, don't you, Stevens?" "I do indeed, sir." "Good. So we both know where we stand. But let's face the facts. His lordship is in deep waters. I've watched him swimming further and further out. Let me tell you, I'm getting very anxious. He's out of his depth, you see, Stevens." "That's so, sir." "Stevens, do you know what is happening at this very moment? As we sit here talking. What's happening just several yards from us, over in that room, and I don't need to confirm it. There is gathered at this moment the British Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, and German Ambassador. His Lordship has worked wonders to bring this meeting about. He faithfully believes, that he's doing something good and honorable. You know why his Lordship has brought these gentlemen here tonight? Do you know, Stevens, what is going on here?" "I'm afraid not." "You're afraid not. Tell me, Stevens. Don't you care at all? Aren't you curious? Good God, man, something very crucial is going on in this house. Aren't you at all curious?" "It is not my place to be curious about such matters, sir." "But you care about his lordship." "こんばんは。猫好きさん来てくれてありがとう。あ、チャネポもちゃんと使ってるね。いらっしゃい。今日はゆっくり本読んでます。でも今はちょっと休憩してコーヒーを入れようと思ってる。ちょっと待っててくれるかな。聞いても返事もしてるから大丈夫かな。コーヒー持ってくる。ダンスかな。はい、コーヒー作ってくる。
ちょっとブレンダーの声が、いや、声じゃないね。音がするかも。コーヒーと牛乳と砂糖。それだけで十分かな。ちょっとバニラも入れようか。ちょっとだけバニラ入れようか。ほんの少しだけ。俺の、いや、バニラアイスじゃない。それは、人だよ。人はコーヒーに入れない。多分。俺の猫がバニラの匂いが好きじゃないらしい。普通にちゃんと読んでるね。急に。牛乳はどこ？あ、あ、ちょっと待ってください。画面見てないけど。ナイスビッツだね。ビッツありがとう、すみません。5ビッツもくれて。テンバーだね。スミヤニテンバー。バニラいいよね。すみやさん、ビッツありがとう。いやいや、本読みは自分勝手にやってること。牛乳はどこ？あ、冷蔵庫に入れておいた。忘れてた。ちょっとだけ涼しくなってるから、外に置いていてもいいかも。でも、さっき、いや、先週までは暑かったから、外で置いたら多分まずくなる。もうちょっと牛乳入れよう。足りないかも。一マグまでは足りない。それ。これでちょっとミュートしますね。ブレンダーの音がうるさくなるから。 コーヒー入れた。ただいま。戻りました。ダンスありがとう。お帰りありがとう。猫好きさん。どこにいたっけ？ここだったか。Something very crucial is going on in this house. Aren't you at all curious? It is not my place to be curious about such matters, sir. But you care about his lordship. You care deeply, you just told me that. If you care about his lordship, shouldn't you be concerned? At least a little curious? The British Prime Minister and the German Ambassador are brought together by your employer for secret talks tonight, and you're not even curious. I would not say I'm not curious, sir. However, it is not my position to display curiosity about such matters. It's not your position. I suppose you believe that to be loyalty to you. Do you think that's being loyal to his lordship or to the crown? Come to that. I'm sorry, sir. I fail to see what it is you are proposing. Mr. Cardinal sighed again and shook his head. I'm not proposing anything, Mr. Stevens. Quite frankly, I don't know what's to be done. But you might at least be curious. He was silent for a moment, during which time he seemed to be gazing emptily at the area of carpet around my feet. Sure you won't join me in a drink, Stevens? He said eventually. No, thank you, sir. I'll tell you this, Stevens. His lordship is being made a fool of. I've done a lot of investigating. I know the situation in Germany now, as well as anyone in this country. And I'll tell you, his lordship is being made a fool of. I gave no reply, and Mr. Cardinal went on gazing emptily at the floor. After a while, he continued. His lordship is a dear, dear man. Fact is, he is out of his depth. He is being maneuvered. The Nazis are maneuvering him like a pawn. Have you noticed this, Stevens? Have you noticed this is what has been happening for the last 3 or 4 years at least? I'm sorry, sir, I have failed to notice any such development. Haven't you even had a suspicion? The smallest suspicion that Herr Hitler, through our dear friend Herr Ribbentrop, has been maneuvering his lordship like a pawn, just as easily as he maneuvers any of his other pawns back in Berlin. I'm sorry, sir, but I'm afraid I have not noticed any such development. But I suppose you wouldn't, Stevens, because you're not curious. You just let all this go on before you, and you never think to look at it for what it is. Mr. Cardinal adjusted his position in the armchair so that he was a little more upright, and for a moment he seemed to be contemplating his unfinished work on the desk nearby. Then he said, His lordship is a gentleman. That's what's at the root of it. He's a gentleman and he fought a war with the Germans. And it's his instinct to offer generosity and friendship to a defeated foe. It's his instinct, but he's a gentleman, a true old English gentleman. And you must have seen it, Stevens. How could you not have seen it, the way they've used it, manipulated it, turned something fine and noble into something else, something they can use for their own foul ends? You must have seen it, Stevens. Mr. Cardinal was once again staring at the floor. He remained silent for a few moments, then he said, I remember coming here years ago.
and there was this American chap here. We were having a big conference. My father was involved in organizing it. I remember this American chap, even drunker than I am now. He got up at the dinner table in front of the whole company, and he pointed at his lordship and called him an amateur. Called him a bungling amateur, and said he was out of his depth. Well, I have to say, Stephen, that American chap was quite right. It's a fact of life. Today's world is too foul a place for fine and noble instincts. You've seen it yourself, haven't you, Stevens? The way they've manipulated fine and noble. Fine and noble. You've seen it yourself, haven't you? I'm sorry, sir, but I have to say, I can't say I have. You can't say you have. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm going to do something about it. If father were alive, he would do something to stop it. Mr. Cardinal fell silent, and for a moment perhaps it was to do with his having evoked memories of his late father. He looked extremely melancholy. Are you content, Stevens, he said finally, to watch his lordship go over the precipice just like that? I'm sorry, sir, I don't fully understand what it is you're referring to. You don't understand, Stevens. Well, we're friends, and so I'll put it to you frankly. Over the last few years, his lordship has probably been the single most useful pawn Herr Hitler has had in this country for his propaganda tricks. All the better because he's sincere and honorable and doesn't recognize the true nature of what he's doing. During the last 3 years alone, his lordship has been critically instrumental in establishing links between Berlin and over 60 of the most influential cities of this country. It's worked beautifully for them. Herr Ribbentrop's been able virtually to bypass their foreign office altogether. And as if their wretched rally and their wretched Olympic Games weren't enough, do you know what they've got his lordship working on now? Do you have any idea what is being discussed now? I'm afraid not, sir. His lordship has been trying to persuade the Prime Minister himself to accept an invitation to visit Herr Hitler. He really believes there is a terrible misunderstanding on the Prime Minister's part concerning the present German regime. I cannot see what there is to object to that. His lordship has always striven to aid better understanding between nations. And that's not all, Stevens. At this very moment, unless I am very much mistaken, at this very moment, his lordship is discussing the idea of His Majesty himself visiting Herr Hitler. His Majesty himself. It's hardly a secret our new king has always been an enthusiast for the Nazis. Well, apparently he's now keen to accept Herr Hitler's invitation. At this very moment, Stevens, his lordship is doing what he can to remove foreign office objections to this appalling idea. I'm sorry, sir, but I cannot see that his lordship is doing anything other than that which is highest and noblest. He is doing what he can, after all, to ensure that peace will continue to prevail in Europe. Tell me, Stevens, aren't you struck by even the remote possibility that I am correct? Are you not at least curious about what I'm saying? I am sorry, sir, but I have to say that I have every trust in his lordship's good judgment. No one with good judgment could persist in believing anything Herr Hitler says after the Rhineland, Stevens. His lordship is out of his depth. Oh dear, now I've really offended you. Not at all, sir, I said, for I had risen on hearing the hell from the drawing room. I appeared to be required by the gentleman. Risen on hearing the bell from the drawing room. I appear to be required by the gentleman. Please excuse me. In the drawing room, the air was thick with tobacco smoke indeed. The distinguished gentlemen continued to smoke their cigars, solemn expression on their faces, not uttering a word, while his lordship instructed me to bring up a certain exceptionally fine bottle of port from the cellar. At such a time of night, one's footsteps descending the back staircase are bound to be conspicuous, and no doubt they were responsible for rousing Miss Kenton. For as I was making my way along the darkness of the corridor, the door to her parlor opened and she appeared at the threshold, illuminated by the light from within. "I am surprised to find you still down there, Miss Kenton," I said as I approached. "Mr. Stevens, I was very foolish early on. Excuse me, Miss Kenton, but I have not the time to talk just now. Mr. Stevens, you mustn't take anything I said earlier to heart. I was simply being foolish." "I have not taken anything you have said to heart, Miss Kenton. In fact, I cannot recall what it is you might be referring to. Events of great importance are unfolding upstairs, and I can hardly stop to exchange pleasantries with you. I would suggest you retire for the night." With that, I hurried on, and it was not until I had all but reached the kitchen doors that the darkness falling again in the corridor told me Miss Kenton had closed her parlor door. It did not take me long to locate the bottle in question down in the cellar and to make the necessary preparations for its serving. It was then only a few minutes after my short encounter with Miss Kenton that I found myself walking down the corridor again on my return journey, this time bearing a tray. As I approached Miss Kenton's door, I saw from the lights seeping through around its edges that she was still within, and that was the moment I am now sure that had remained so persistently lodged in my memory. That moment, as I passed in the dimness of the corridor, that tray in my hands, an ever-growing conviction mounting within me that just a few yards away on the other side of the door, Miss Kenton was at that moment crying. As I recall, there was no real evidence to account for this conviction. I had certainly not heard any sounds of crying, and yet I remember being quite certain that were I to knock and enter, I would discover her in tears. I do not know how long I remained standing there. At the time, it seemed a significant period. But in reality, I suspect it was only a matter of a few seconds, for of course I was required to hurry upstairs to serve some of the most distinguished gentlemen of the land, and I cannot imagine I would have delayed unduly. When I returned to the drawing room, I saw that the gentlemen were still in a rather serious mood. Beyond this, however, I had little chance to gain any impression of the atmosphere, for no sooner had I entered than his lordship was taking the tray from me, saying, "Thank you, Stevens, I'll see to it. That'll be all." Crossing the hall again, I took up my usual position beneath the arch, and for the next hour or so, until, that is, the gentleman finally departed, no event occurred which obliged me to move from my spot. Nevertheless, that hour I spent standing there has stayed very vividly in my mind throughout the years. At first, my mood was, I do not mind admitting it, somewhat downcast. But then, as I continued to stand there, a curious thing began to take place. That is to say, a deep feeling of triumph started to well up within me, I cannot remember to what extent I analyzed this feeling at the time. But today, looking back on it, it does not seem so difficult to account for. I had, after all, just come through an extremely tiring evening, throughout which I had managed to preserve a dignity in keeping with my position, and had done so, moreover, in a manner even my father might have been proud of. And there across the hall, behind the very doors upon which my gaze was then resting, within the very room where I had just executed my duties, the most powerful gentlemen of Europe were conferring over the fate of our continent. Who would doubt at that moment that I had indeed come as close to the great hub of things as any butler could wish? I would suppose, then, that as I stood there, pondering the events of the evening, those that unfolded and those that still in the process of doing so, they appeared to me a sort of summary of all that I had come to achieve thus far in my life. I can see few other explanations for that sense of triumph I came to be uplifted by that night. ちょっと集中力が解けてますから、これで終わりにしますね。今日は2時間も超えた。1時間半までかな。明日は最後になるかもね。もう10ページしか残らない。10枚しか残らないから。明日本読みにしようか。本読みにして、これの終わりを読んでみましょう。おつありがとう、皆さん。いつも来てくれてる。本当に心強い。今日、ビツも投げてくれた。ありがとうね。ちゃんと使おう。今日来てくれて皆さんも、サリさん、ピーちゃん、猫好きさんも、スミヤさんももちろん来てくれてありがとう。明日は同じ時間にやるね。日本の17時でね。午後5時。午後5時。いや、17時は1時になる。18時に始めます。明日は。それじゃあ、どこかへ飛ばそうかね。あ、ベンさんが今何をやってる？本会スターやってます。あそこへ飛ばそうね。聞いてくれてまたありがとう。もうそれ以上言葉は知らないかな。でも、聞いてくれて本当にありがとう。それじゃあレードしますから、終わりの歌を歌いましょうね。皆さんもご一緒にありがとう。ダメだね、ダメよ、ダメなのよ。あんたが好きで好きすぎて、どれだけ強いお酒でも歪まない思い出がバカみたい。
本当にいい曲だね。
はい、さようなら。また明日。バイバイ。